Being reasonable. It's the most ineluctably necessary and yet most difficult thing for human beings to do, particularly in politics. Imagine if a situation had transpired in Montreal, Canada, very much parallel to what transpired within the last 12 months in Hong Kong, China. Do you think that the government of Canada would be so patient, so tolerant, and so broadly speaking non-violent in standing by and allowing pro-democracy protesters to shut down the universities in downtown Montreal, Canada, allowing them to shut down all the major roads and highways that flow through Montreal, Canada, and allowing them ultimately to shut down and occupy the airport for Montreal, Canada? Do you think the Canadian government would have responded as obligingly? Would they have shown so much tolerance and so much patience as we saw the communist government of China show? Now, you may protest that the cause represented by the protests in Hong Kong is very pious and good. Challenge yourself. Think it through if you would approve of the same methods and tactics if it were a cause you do not sympathize with, you do not agree with, where you don't valorize the objectives. What if, instead of pro-democracy protesters and pro-independence protesters, by the way, both claims that revolutionaries in Quebec could make, and historically in the recent past they have made, that they wanted independence and democracy in Quebec for Quebecers and so on. You can imagine much of the same rhetoric could apply to Montreal, Quebec, and their independence, pro-democracy, sovereignty movements, so on and so forth. Imagine if the same tactics were being used by anti-abortion protesters, people who want abortion to be made illegal. Depending on where you live when you're watching this video, it's quite likely that 40% of the people who surround you would prefer if abortion were illegal. It's quite possible you live somewhere where 60% of people are morally opposed to abortion. And in case you don't know, this isn't just an issue within Christianity, Christian-dominated cultures. It's an issue within Islam. It's an issue within Chinese culture. It's an issue within Indian culture, which is to say Hindu culture. It's an issue within Buddhism worldwide. Buddhists are anti-abortion, in case you didn't know, including even Tibetan Buddhists, supposedly groovy groups like that. If you actually get to know Chinese people on a one-to-one basis, you'll figure out that most of them are actually quite a bit more strongly opposed to abortion than Catholics in the modern West. To give a very brief digression or example, many Catholics will say they are opposed to abortion in abstract and in general, but when it happens to them, when it's their own family, their own unplanned pregnancy, or when they themselves get pregnant, for example, with a child with Down syndrome, if they become pregnant with a fetus and it's proven to have Down syndrome, Catholics in the modern West generally will get abortions when it suits their purpose. You can meet a lot of Chinese people alive right now in the 21st century who made the opposite choice when it was them, when it was their life on the line, when it was their baby on the line, etc. They really lived by it. So I won't comment further on Hindu India. It hasn't been as much a part of my life, but you could say something broadly similar. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, these are actually all anti-abortion. So the potential is there. Anti-abortion protesters could shut down your university. Anti-abortion protesters could shut down the highways of your capital city, wherever you live. Anti-abortion protesters could shut down the airport. And from their perspective, they're representing a cause even more pious and sacred and good than the cause of democracy or independence, because from their perspective, they're trying to prevent the murder of innocent people. They have total faith in their own cause. Your outside perspective may not see it that way, but the outside perspective of people in Beijing may not see the situation in Hong Kong that way. And the outside perspective of people in Toronto and Vancouver and New York, they may not see Quebecois independence and the Quebecois claims about democracy in that same way. Let's just cut right to the chase here with one more example. Do you think the Canadian government would tolerate similar protests from our Indigenous people, our First Nations people, for even 5 minutes? If the Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, Iroquois, if our Native people shut down the airport in Montreal, shut down university campuses, shut down roads through violence, let's be clear, although it wasn't a ton of violence, the creation and maintenance of the barricades in downtown Hong Kong, including shutting down their subway system, by the way, preventing the subways from working, people couldn't enter and exit subways, but actually closing off those roads, closing off the campuses, it involved violence, okay? And you could imagine similarly, if a bunch of really passionate Native people, Indigenous people, First Nations people in Canada, Cree, Dene, Ojibwe, if they all got organized and all arrived at Montreal Airport at the same time, they could shut down the airport, all right? If you believe that civil disobedience is good in and of itself, right, then you have to approve of it when it's applied to these various cases equally. If it's acceptable to shut down the airport for one cause, then it's acceptable to shut down the airport for another. Don't judge the method by the goodness of the cause or the objectives being pursued by that cause, right? You have to judge the method in and of itself. Nobody will sympathize with the government of Communist China. And that's because it is an unelected dictatorship. And holding elections and permitting a free press to criticize the government and certain measures of transparency, those are the bare minimum requirements for legitimacy in the 21st century. It's not the maximum requirements. I do not regard the government of George W. Bush as being particularly legitimate, and you might remember he actually didn't win that election. Long story. Way back in the year 2000, before most of you were born. I'm sure you don't remember. It's not such ancient history. It wasn't so long ago that the United States itself did not meet these minimum requirements for legitimacy in government. That's really worth meditating on. That's really worth reflecting on and learning from the future. Okay? It is inevitable that no one is going to sympathize with the government of China precisely because it is an unelected communist dictatorship. However, sympathy is not just for your friends. Sympathy is not just for people you agree with. Sympathy is not just for people who are on the same team as yourself. Sympathy is an analytical tool, and it's absolutely crucial that in the pursuit of political change, we use sympathy as an analytical tool to understand our enemies, to understand people who are strange and exotic and distant and far removed from us, whether that is the government of China, the government of Iraq, or the government of Afghanistan.